Hi, this is Anderson Miller, and this is my podcast on Jerry Brudos. So, Jerome Henry Jerry Brudos was an American serial killer, and he committed murders of at least four women in Oregon between 1968 and 1969. So, a little bit about Jerry's biography. He was actually born in January 31st, 1939, in Webster, South Dakota, and he died in March 28th, 2006, in the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, Oregon. His full name was Jerome Henry Brudos. His spouse was Darcy Brudos, and she lived from 1961 to 1970. His education was from the North Salem High School, and the names of his parents were Eileen Brudos and Henry Brudos. So Jerome was the younger of two sons that his mother had. And as a child, Brutus and his family would always move to different homes in the Pacific Northwest before they finally settled in Salem, Oregon. So to tie this into nurture and nature, I'd say nurture had more of an effect on Jerome because his mother had always wanted a girl and was very displeased that she had even had Jerome because he was a boy. So after this, she would always constantly subject him to emotional and physical abuse as a child. So after all this abuse his mother gave him as a child, I feel like this kind of led to more of his mental instability. And so at the age of 5, Brutus had began to have a fetish for women's shoes, weirdly enough. And after playing with stiletto-heeled shoes at a local junkyard, this is also what contributed to his shoe fetish. When Brutus became a teenager, he began to stalk local women, knocking them down or choking them unconscious and fleeing with only their shoes. So this kind of ties into the psychopath and sociopath debate. So sociopaths are more of a hot-headed and they think without acting and they don't think about how others will be affected. And psychopaths are more cold-hearted and they're usually calculating and carefully plotting out their next crimes. So I'd say Jerome Brutus was more of a sociopath because he only cared about the shoes that the women had and didn't really think about them personally. This also shows that he completely fits the definition of a serial killer, because a serial killer is a person who commits a series of murders with no apparent motive, and they're typically following a characteristic or predictable behavior pattern. And his behavior pattern was only wanting the shoes that these women had. So when Jerome first turned 18, he actually abducted and beat a young woman and threatened to stab her if she didn't follow his demands on giving him her shoes. And shortly after he was arrested, he was taken to a psychiatric ward in Oregon State Hospital for 9 months. And there they had tested him and found out that it was all due to his hatred towards his mother. Once Brutus was released from the psych ward, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And despite all this, Brutus actually was still able to graduate with his high school class in 1957. And shortly after his graduation, he became an electronics technician. So Brutus would keep the shoes, underwear, and the bodies of his victims in the garage of his house, and he would not allow his wife to enter without her first announcing that she was coming home on an intercom that he had set up through the house. So his first victim was Linda Swalson, a 19-year-old door-to-door encyclopedia saleswoman. She had knocked on Brutus's door in 1968, and Brutus lured her into the basement and knocked her out with a wooden plank and strangled her. He then dressed her up in different clothes and had stolen her shoes. Jerome's second victim was a woman named Karen Springer. She was 18 years old when she was abducted at gunpoint in a parking lot outside the department store in May 1968. Brutus was dressed in woman's clothes when he attacked her, and he had brought her to her garage and made her try on a collection of clothing that he had and made her pose as he photographed her. He then, unfortunately, went on to rape her and strangled her by hanging her from a pulley. So Jerome's third victim was a woman named Jan Susan Whitney, who was a 23-year-old motorist whose car broke down on Interstate 5 between Salem and Albany on November 26, 1968. Brutus had offered to drive her home and told her that a tow truck was going to be coming on the way. But while they were in the car on the way home, he had strangled her with a leather strap and continued to rape her like he did with most of his victims. He had eventually taken her back to his garage and left her hanging from a pulley. Two of Jerome's victims, Sharon Wood, who was 24 years old, and Gloria Jean Smith, who was 15 years old, he had attempted to abduct at gunpoint, but fortunately enough, these women were able to get away from him. But his last victim, Linda Say Lee, who was a 22-year-old woman, was not as lucky. She was unfortunately abducted from a shopping mall parking lot on April 23rd, and Brutus had taken her back to her garage and raped her and strangled her, as he had also tried to drive an electrical current through her body in order to make it jump, which had failed. But in the end, he ended up murdering her. Through all these sick, twisted murders, he was finally caught and he was given life imprisonment in the penitentiary in Salem, Oregon, where then he died in March 28, 2006. Jerome definitely deserved the criminal penalty he got, and I really hope that there's nobody out there with the same mentality that this man had, and no woman has to go through the pain that this man has caused. All in all, this pretty much sums up my podcast on Jerome Jeremy Brudos, the sociopath.